Ginny jerked awake, disoriented for a few seconds. She stared at the wooden beams overhead, trying to figure out, oh, right, she was at the cabin for Christmas. She rubbed her eyes, pushed the hair off her face, and sat up. Everything looked the same as it had last night. Suitcases open, contents spilling out, snow piled up on the outside window ledges, and their teen crush posters on the walls. So why? She gave her head a shake and got up. Why would anything be different? She rested a hand on the bedside table, and reality shifted for a minute. That was her hand. Did she think it would be different? Different how? Her water bottle sat where she'd left it last night. All was as it should be, just having a little trouble shaking off sleep. And that dream, why couldn't she remember it? Oh well. It happens sometimes. She shrugged on her robe, made a pass through the bathroom, and then headed downstairs. The sight of the green alien on the entry table stopped her in her tracks, about 4 steps short of the bottom. She glanced around, not sure exactly why she felt uneasy at the sight of it. After a pause, she approached it, though cautiously for some reason. It looked like an inflatable alien, not... "What's wrong?" Dex asked from the kitchen doorway. He had their youngest on his hip, her tiny face still glistening from being recently washed. Her head was nestled against her dad's broad shoulder, and Jeannie's heart turned to mush in her chest at the sight. 2 kids, and he could still curl the toes in her slippers. "You're both up early. I didn't hear a thing." Not like her, but she had been tired last night after spending a long day chasing kids and getting the cabin ready for Van and her family to arrive. This was the first time they'd been back for Christmas at the cabin since Desi, Jeannie blinked, since their mom had disappeared in a blizzard 4 years ago. Dex had been more than their rock during that hard time. He'd been the shoulder she leaned on and cried on. Plus, he knew Desi, knew her mom almost as well as she did. She could talk about Mom, and he understood. It was a bit weird they hadn't found her body in the spring, but there was some rugged areas not far from the cabin, and in a way, she was glad they hadn't. Without a body, she could pretend her mom just left. "You were pretty deep asleep." Dex transferred the baby to his other shoulder so he could pull her close for a hug and a kiss. "Where is young Desi?" Of course, they'd named their first daughter after her mom. She even kind of looked like her grandma, though her hair wasn't long enough for red pigtails yet. Jeannie blinked because she could see them so clearly. She's still working on her cereal. Their 3-year-old was probably smearing it all over the table, but both table and kid could be washed. 4 years, and she was still amazed they were together. And so grateful she hadn't given the big chill an answer before she left for the holidays that year. He'd found a PA and wife, much better suited to his perfect life than imperfect geek Genie. Her thoughts flickered as a memory of the big chill here, in this hall, danced briefly inside her head. That was weird. He'd never been here. He'd thought about it, he said, obviously relieved when she turned him down. She snuggled into Dex's shoulder, loving the long-limbed guyness of her sweetheart, and wished that her mom has lived long enough to meet her grandkids. She wanted some so much. "You okay?" Dex asked. His voice rumbled in the chest her cheek pressed against. She nodded. "Was just wishing my mom could be here." Why did she keep calling her mom Desi? She'd never. The inflatable alien caught her eye, and a shiver of unease danced down her spine. Where did that come from? It wasn't here last night, was it? "Did it seem?" Dex-10 said. "No." She lifted her head. There was something in his eyes that made her lean back and study him. She glanced at the alien and then looked at him again. She rubbed her face with the hand not resting against his back. "Is anything wrong?" he asked, almost hopefully. "It's just, I had the strangest dream last night." She stopped when his brows lifted. The fuzzy details of the dream sharpened. "I had a dream." And in the dream, she'd insisted she'd been dreaming. Weirdness. The heater kicked on, sending a gentle surge of air through the room and dislodging something. It floated off the table and drifted to the floor. Gini bent and picked it up. A feather, a feather. She turned to Dex with, she was pretty sure, a slack jaw. He grinned. It took you long enough to remember. I've been biting my tongue for 4 years. But that's not... She stopped, with the feeling she'd said that before, and been wrong then too. She dragged the feather between her thumb and index fingers. Had it been waiting for her to remember, or she eased the inflatable forward and checked the back? There was a tab to release the air. She sighed, and Dex chuckled. Is the SF author saying she doesn't believe? But her voice trailed off as memory of that Christmas 4 years ago unspooled in her dead, memories quite at odds with how she thought it had been. 4 years? Why did you remember? She straightened. Did they mess with my memory? The lack of trust kind of hurt. That earned her a look. You think I know how any of this worked? I'm just the sheriff, not the whatever I'd need to be to know how it all worked. When did you remember? He didn't speak, and more outrage surged. You never forgot, did you? He looked rueful. Well, someone needed to manage Desi's disappearance. So you knew? You always knew. Why didn't you say anything? Would you have believed me? She stared at him, unwilling to admit she might not have. And if she'd thought he was crazy. But Van and Biff, the emergency... Turns out they were studying some interesting space debris. It kind of looked spaceship-ish, but wasn't anything after all. Do you think they messed with their memories, too? The big chill sure hadn't seemed to remember. I didn't ask. I was just glad to have a second chance with you. I didn't want to mess it up. He took her hand in his and led her into the great room. Somehow, he managed to get her seated on the couch, the baby tucked between them. She stared at the big tree covered in her mom's ode to NASA ornaments, glittering in the dim light filtering into snow and frost-covered windows. And there was Spock in his usual spot, urging them to live long and prosper. Did you ever before, think about coming to see me? All the time. Well, why didn't you? She wouldn't have been hard to convince. She hadn't been hard to convince. She'd played hard to get for maybe a minute. I asked Desi how you were doing, and she told me about this big job you had. He stopped. I hadn't found your books then. If I had, nothing would have stopped me. I only found them earlier that year. Stumbled onto one in a used bookstore. I had this feeling of knowing something, so I bought them all. And as I read them, I knew. I knew. So I started the ball rolling to get here. To be here when you came. Gini stared at the tree. Do you think she knew? Dex shook his head. I honestly don't know. I just know she was right. About, Gini prompted, wondering which right he referred to. She said it would be the best Christmas ever. It had been a great Christmas, despite her mom not going missing in the snowstorm. Had some part of her known, way down deep inside, that her mom was okay, that she wasn't lost in the storm but off to the stars with one? Good Christmases had followed that one, though they'd been spent elsewhere. A wedding, 2 kids, so much happiness. There'd been sorrow, but it had been tinged with the sense that her mom was now one of the happy ghosts lingering here with their dad. Had their dad known about the aliens? Young Desi chose that moment to trot in, dripping cereal from chin and hands. Dex jumped up, scooped her up, and holding her away from his clothes, carried her out for cleaning. Gini hugged her baby close, inhaling her sweet baby scent. This would be the best Christmas ever, until the next one, and the one after that. From this old couch, she could see a long line of happy Christmases stretching into a future that would hold, hopefully, a couple more kids sledding and skating and drinking hot chocolate and watching for Santa to come. Though she'd be totally okay if Santa stayed mysterious and invisible and out of their Red Ryder sled. I hope you enjoyed listening to Up on the Housetop. Subscribe to my channel to get updated when I post more of my audiobooks.